Welcome to the Unwanted Opinion podcast, the show in which me and my friends give our unwanted opinions on all things film. My name is Lewis, and I'm joined today with Gonzalo.
Hi, how we doing?
Oh, doing okay. We've got a sad episode lined up for us today.
Yes.
Um, because of course, just last week, or not even last week, David Lynch, probably one of America's greatest auteurs in cinema, passed away on the 15th of January, 5 days before his 79th birthday. So that's kind of what today's episode is going to be about, because I, like many film fans, are a massive fan of David Lynch. He's made some of my absolute favourites, as well as not just his work in film, but actually his prolific work in TV as well. So we're just going to be talking about him, talking about his films today. And it's actually quite nice. Me and Gonzalo can have a contrast here, because I'm someone who's read a lot about him and seen almost everything he's made, whereas Gonzalo is quite new to the Lynch sphere,
Yes,
and has seen one of his films. So we'll talk about that and kind of everything else. But I'll begin, before we kind of get into the Lynch section, with a complete unknown, a review for the Bob Dylan biopic, which is sort of going to be a big awards contender this Oscar season. Pretty sure the nominees are out this Thursday, actually, or is it next Thursday?
I don't know
So
how far they've pushed them back due to the fires, honestly.
Yeah, I think it was meant to be last week,
It
but
was meant to
obviously
be
it
last week,
got delayed because of the LA fires. So A Complete Unknown was directed by James Mangold, who also very famously made the Johnny Cash biopic Walk the Line. It stars
Yes.
Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan, as well as Edward Norton, Monica Barbaro, and Elle Fanning. And it sort of goes through this brief portion in Bob Dylan's sort of rise to fame. He's 19 years old, just sort of hitchhiked to New York, and this sort of follows him from 1961 up until 1965, and kind of his first three albums. So I think it kind of ends with oh God, what's the name of it? Highway Revisited 61. I think that's sort of the last sort of, not even finishing that album. That's just sort of kind of on the precursor there. I don't really know much about Bob Dylan. I've listened to like a handful of his albums. I like what I've listened to. I haven't extensively listened to his 55 album collection. He's made that many. He's also the first and only Nobel Prize winner for literature. I mean, the only songwriter who's won a Nobel Prize for literature. And quite funny, this isn't really a spoiler, because obviously you can know all this stuff. But when the film ends and it tells you, when the film ends and it gives you all the text and stuff of things that subsequently happen in their life, it does humorously end with, and he won the Nobel Prize for literature. He did not attend the ceremony. Because what the film honestly does, and I think this is kind of one of its biggest strengths, so because I'm not the biggest biopic fan, never mind music biopics. We have actually done a whole episode, I think maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, about sort of flaws. we're not biopic fans. There's the occasional few which we really like, especially ones that definitely have more like artistic
lenience.
The ones that kind of get more
interesting routes. There is as with any really historical film and biopics, there is a tendency to just sort of create a list rather than a film where you just subsequently hit the most well-known moments of a person's life with a very tenuous kind of like character arc going throughout that tends to not explore really the figure itself, but try to simplify it into a very simplistic hero's journey kind of thing. And it's the main thing that like we kind of struggle with when it comes to biopics. Walk the Line was for me one of those where I was like, this is just kind of biopic.
Yeah, it's kind of biopic, and that's kind of thing, especially with music biopics. We've had our problems. I mean, recently we've had the likes of like Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a sort of travesty of a film,
that
and
one
then
doesn't
the
know
Elvis.
how to edit, but
no, and then you get the Elvis one, which I remember I gave this podcast a 5 out of 10 because it had moments of genuine brilliance, but was weighed down by just terrible choices in the first act and like a really bad Tom Hanks performance. And also it being a biopic was one that was very afraid to
do anything.
Tackle the real problems with that figure.
Whereas
this one's a bit Yeah.
I think on a contrast, I really liked the Elton John biopic, for example,
Yeah.
which like
Yeah, that one's pretty good
had a
actually. I like
really
that one. Rocket
interesting
Man.
take. Yeah, it
Hmm.
did something really interesting. It turned it into a musical
Hmm.
rather than like
Yep.
going through his performances as you usually do.
Yeah.
They took his music and used it to tell
Yeah.
a very short period of his life as a story.
Yeah.
Which again,
Yeah.
when we tend to focus on short periods of interesting people's
Mhm.
lives, they tend to make
Yeah.
for better biopics.
Yeah, and that segues very nicely into
Mm.
the fact that this only covers a 4-year portion of Bob Dylan's
That's
life.
that's a good
It's
green flag
it's
right there.
very focused and concentrated on that,
Yeah.
which I like. Because oh
Mm.
my God, imagine if you tried to do a Bob Dylan biopic encompassing he's like 84 now. Like Jesus Christ, it would be a
Yeah,
failure.
it would.
So it really focuses on his beginnings and his rise to fame, which I
Mm.
think to my surprise, I
Mm.
actually kind of liked this film.
Okay, interesting.
Like I said, because I have so many problems with music biopics, and I don't know if it's because I really don't know much about Bob Dylan.
Mm.
So I kind of liked its honesty
Mm.
and the fact that Bob Dylan isn't likable in this film.
Mm.
He's one who alienates, especially the women in his life. Cheats on his girlfriend, and also is quite narcissistic and difficult to be around,
Mm.
and someone who really just is sort of cantankerous and just wants to do his own thing, which you kind of if you're going to be a huge success and one of the most acclaimed songwriters in contemporary music,
Mm.
that's kind of who you are and who you kind of have to be to do that. And I have to really give credit to Timothy Chalamet. His Bob Dylan voice is pretty effective. It works for
Yeah.
me, and he is a really good singer.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, he already proved that with Wonka. He could do
Yeah.
a musical. But this is obviously very different singing. Bob Dylan has a very particular singing voice.
Yes, he does.
Not obviously the most beautiful singing voice, but one that definitely has a lot of soul and a lot
Mm.
of character
Interesting.
to it.
Yeah.
And Timothy Chalamet provides that. It's a really good performance. It's
Mm.
one that over times like, wow, that's his version. As his version, it's very
Mm.
close to very mimicking Bob Dylan.
Mm.
But I'm like, wow, there's a really good moment. I really enjoyed the film where he sings the times they are changing,
Mm.
and at this folk festival, and I like that scene so much because it kind of looks at all these different people in his life at the time and what that song means to them, what
Mm.
the lyrics are saying to them, at that given point, and how it really hurts some of the people, whereas other people are like, oh my God, this is an absolute smash hit. Oh my God, I
Mm.
can't wait to get this on vinyl.
Mm. Yeah.
Make some
Yeah.
more money. And I really kind of like that variation.
See, that's interesting.
Sort of across the field.
That
Yeah.
signals to me that the movie seems to be focused a lot more on those kind of characters and stuff, because a big drawback of music biopics tends to be that
Mhm.
yeah, they play the most famous songs, but they play them for the sake of playing them. There's no reason why
Mhm.
we're hearing this song at this specific time other than hey, it's one of the popular songs and it's
Mhm.
about that time in their
Yeah.
life when they wrote it.
Yeah.
So it is
Yeah.
interesting that they're not just having Timothée Chalamet play a song, but they're having it be like a interesting moment when it comes to the development of the
Mhm.
characters that we see in the
Mhm.
film. Like it's
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
green flag,
I mean,
honestly.
it, it,
Yeah.
it does have some moments
Hmm.
like of just like
Hmm.
classic genre conventions where it's like,
I could
where
imagine.
it does the thing where it's like, oh, Bob Dylan's he's in someone's house and he's
Someone says the
starting
thing.
he's starting to write
Yeah.
girl from north was it
Yeah.
girl from the north country,
Hmm.
which one of his most famous songs, and does that thing where Edward Norton's behind him
Yeah.
and he sort of looks at Timothy Chalamet, and then he looks at his wife and he's like, oh, wink wink, this is
It's a hit.
this is going to be a big hit one
And then
day.
it
And you're
cuts
like,
to
right,
him.
okay, we get it. It's like even me who
Yeah.
doesn't know every Bob Dylan song is
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
for the love of God, right, we get it.
Yeah.
It has that. It does have
Yeah.
some of that in it,
Yeah.
Edward Norton's performance, he plays this guy, Peter
Hmm.
Seeger, who's like kind of is Bob Dylan's kind of agent, the guy who kind of
Hmm.
discovers him. And it's a really quite different Edward Norton performance because he's not playing an asshole, or he's
Hmm.
not playing like a weirdo, or
Hmm.
like a pretentious actor and someone
Yeah.
like Birdman.
Hmm.
He's actually playing someone quite sweet and quite
Hmm.
tender. Maybe towards the end of the film, he kind of has his own sort of sort of ideas of what he wants Bob Dylan to be, and
Mm.
Bob Dylan starts to break away from that. But I really liked Edward Norton's performance, as well as Monica Barbaro, who plays Joan Baez, right, who has her own illustrious songwriting and a career herself, because a lot of the film deals with their relationship and how they sort of, because they don't really have a relationship, they have an on again off again thing. He cheats on his girlfriend at the time, Sylvie, with her. This is all pretty very well documented, and they sort of very interesting sort of professional relationship too. And this is kind of where I get to my gripes with it, though, is that Joan Baez is really integral to the first 2/3 of this film, and then the film just kind of forgets about her for the final portion.
Okay.
Even though they sort of set up that she's going to be, carry on being quite integral, and they kind of have like almost a fallout on stage at one moment in the film, but then she just kind of disappears until like there's actually a bit where he's at this folk festival at the end of the film and he wants to sort of debut his more rock and roll stuff, and she has no dialogue, and I just found it really weird that she was just kind of standing there as almost like an extra. It felt very bizarre, and I don't really know why they kind of put her to the side, because their relationship's one of the most interesting parts of the entire film. And it's the same with Elle Fanning's Sylvie, is that not so much her, because that's kind of the point, is that she does get pushed to the side and alienated by Bob's actions. But yeah, it's interesting with those two characters. I just don't really know that. I'm just like, it felt very disjointed towards the end, especially with those two. And like I say, it does have
has to
moments
do
of
with, because I have no idea how the film ends, but do you think it has to do maybe they wanted the ending to be a very specific kind of like thing, and it just didn't fit with the rest of the thing? Like, how does the film end in that sense? Like, is it a specific crescendo or a specific moment where they wanted to focus on that, and that's why like they kind of sacrificed the story so far just to give you that ending? Or
no, because it's like, so with the third act, it's like Joan Baez is at this festival as well, and then they don't really interact with each other until one of the last scenes of the film. She kind of comes back into it for a brief moment, but it doesn't really have like an impact. I don't know. I just found it quite jarring, because I think she's so integral to so much of the film, and then she just kind of, I don't know. It's not even like she just like they save her for that final scene. They just have her standing around. It just feels a bit odd. And like I say, it does fall into those classic sort of conventions. And look, if you know anything about Bob Dylan, the film isn't super insightful about who he is. I mean, the film's called A Complete Unknown, based on the lyrics of like a Rolling Stone, but and they sort of play with that mystery, and he's actually not called Bob Dylan and all that stuff, and he sort of creates his own sort of myth. That's sort of stuff I liked, but like, yeah, you sort of get a sense of who this man is, but you don't really know him, I guess. But like, it's only a brief period of time, and I kind of understand why he's doing that. But anyway, I'm gonna give A Complete Unknown a 7 out of 10. Because I was never bored either. I wasn't really bored watching it. I was quite entertained. And it's conventional, and it'll get a Best Picture nomination because it's a music biopic. But
I mean, Bohemian Rhapsody
it's
one,
decent.
So
It's a good watch, and it has some good music moments. And I think Timothée Chalamet really is the one who kind of
the one
anchors the whole thing.
That seems to be consistent about these music biopics, regardless of how fucking awful they might end up being, seems to be the main performances. It seems like the main characters do put a lot of work into not just looking and acting like, but sounding like these or these historical figures. So I guess in that case, like, it's not really a surprise. I don't think I've watched a music biopic where I was like, oh, the main character playing this protagonist of the film did a terrible job. Like, they tend to put in a lot of work to make the performance work. It tends to be the structure and the storytelling around them that seems to always kind of like fail.
Let them down.
Yeah.
Although Rami Malek and Bohemian Rhapsody just lip synced his way to an Oscar.
True. But he did.
Timothée Chalamet actually sings.
I will definitely.
Which, and Timothée Chalamet is most likely not going to win an Oscar. I'm sorry, Rami Malek committed a crime winning that Oscar, and then everyone was angry about it, and then ever since then, every music biopic has been like, oh, you guys can't lip sync anymore because it's a bit embarrassing. Ever since then, no one's winning an Oscar for their performance in a music biopic, which is
hilarious.
So weird to me.
Hilarious.
It's
the
so
one
funny.
Time
it's
they
so
do, it's lip sync.
Yeah. Like Taron Egerton, Austin Butler, Timothée Chalamet.
They did a
They're
great
not getting. They're
jobs.
not
They
getting
did great
anything.
jobs
Yeah,
in there.
all better than Rami Malek. You're not winning your
Definitely,
Oscar though, because
definitely.
see if you just lip synced,
That is
guys,
quite
you'd win.
funny. Yeah.
Uh,
I'm
anyway, let's.
looking forward to like meeting some of the people who make the decisions for the Oscars or the Academy, and seeing them talk about how deeply felt the music from Bohemian Rhapsody was. Like he really put his
Yeah.
soul into that performance. But yeah, so
Yes, very good. Okay,
so
yeah, let's
our main
move
topic.
on from this.
Yes.
Our main topic. Let's talk about David Lynch.
Hmm.
So it's always hard to where to begin with David Lynch because his work is so particular and so strange.
Hmm.
But I actually think, Gonzalo,
Yes.
you started in the perfect place.
Hmm.
You started with Blue Velvet,
I
right?
did.
Blue
I did.
Velvet is the Lynch film you've most recently watched.
Yes.
And I think, well, I mean, we're going to get into it.
Hmm.
Blue Velvet, I think, released in what, 1986?
Yes. I
And
want to
it's
say the
sort
80s for
of the
sure.
perfect middle ground of you understand what is meant by the term Lynchian. You get that
Hmm.
sense of weird and surreal, that sense of evil underlying everything. But it's not as surreal or as weird as some of his later works, or even Eraserhead, his first film.
Hmm.
But it's also not as simple as something like Elephant Man or Straight Story. So I think
Hmm.
it's kind of,
A good
let's
middle
start
ground.
with Blue
Okay.
Velvet, a good
Okay.
middle ground, yeah. Because
Yeah.
it's always getting into Lynch is
It's hard.
always
Yeah.
kind of a daunting task,
Yeah.
um, for people watching for the first time.
Hmm.
So what did you make of Blue Velvet
I
in that experience?
actually surprisingly enjoyed having watched
Hmm.
Blue Velvet. I don't know if I
Hmm.
enjoyed the act of watching it. I did
Right,
enjoy having watched it.
right.
It deals with a lot of really hard themes.
Hmm.
Obviously, there's a lot of darkness and there's a lot
Yep.
of uncomfortable kind of like things taken up to the surface. I'm assuming that
Hmm.
is very much kind of like an aspect of Lynch's
Hmm.
films that might put people off, and I can
Yeah.
understand why it might put some people off. He
Hmm.
really had no problem showcasing in full force like these moments of I wouldn't even call it human depravity, but like the worst that
Hmm.
human beings can do.
Yeah.
Like he seems to, with the camera in those moments of darkness, just stay in them. I was surprised
Hmm.
by the editing of this film a
Okay.
lot. There is a lot of really long shots. He
Hmm.
really likes holding his camera, especially in the
He
most
does. He
intense
does.
moments. Like
Hmm.
I was surprised because when I've watched a lot of action movies of the same time and a lot of like
Hmm.
critically acclaimed ones, and the editing seems to be around the 80s starting to look more like the editing that we have nowadays, where it's a lot more erratic and it follows the pacing of the moment. Like quiet moments
Hmm.
have less like cuts, more
Hmm.
intense moments have a lot more cuts. That's kind of like a very basic way of editing that we can see in a lot of film. And it seems to do a lot of the opposite. He seems to willingly just let you stay in those uncomfortable moments with really
Yeah.
long, uncomfortable shots. I really liked the blocking. I know it's a
Hmm.
weird thing to say, but like I
No,
really
no, it's
liked,
he knows
yeah,
how to block his
I
scenes. Yeah.
really liked the blocking in this
Hmm.
film. I think he positions his characters in really interesting ways that make you feel very unsettled.
Yeah.
Just the way characters move around, look
Uh-huh.
at each other,
Uh-huh.
interact, makes it
Uh-huh.
feel kind of like you're watching a stop motion film. You know, that kind of
Hmm.
like feeling of this is real, but it's really not.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. It reminds me a lot of like when you see like those more expressive, weird theater performances where like a lot
Yeah.
of it has to do with like making you feel unsettled and stuff. And I really did enjoy that. The film from the very get go kind of captured me. The
Yeah.
opening I think is
It's
very
it's
powerful.
it's one of the most like
Yeah.
sort of well studied and written about opening
Yeah.
sequences in film.
I can perfectly
That,
understand why.
yeah.
I thought it was really interesting. Some of the choices as well, I really liked. In the
Mhm.
sense where I was like, "Huh, I see what you did there," and I'm okay with it, kind of thing. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
weird things like at the start when we're introduced to our main character that we're going to follow
Hmm.
through the movie. we're introduced to him walking back through a very dumb kind of area and tossing a stone
Mm-hmm.
at some garbage, and then we cut away to see the rest of his day, and then we come back
Mm-hmm.
to him doing that. It's a really interesting, very close up cut to try to kind of like tell you that this is like a routine thing, like try to
Mm-hmm.
get you into that, oh, this is just his day to day, this is what happens, he
Mm-hmm.
walks back through this part of town every day and he does his thing. But it also makes you feel very uncomfortable because of how close those two scenes are and how closely they mimic each other. And I think from that
Yeah.
moment
Yeah.
I was hooked because I understood Lynch's kind of like, and especially like how he's trying to tell you this character has a disdain for his
Mm-hmm.
routine. He has a disdain for that day to day, for that repetitiveness that is a part of his life. And from then on, I kind of understood where he was coming from. At no point did I really like this character, but I very much
Yeah.
understood why he was doing
Uh-huh.
the things he was doing.
Uh-huh.
I think it explores the ideas of duality very well. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
it's very much a kind of like farcical look at that 1950s perfect Americana.
Yeah.
And a study of the horrors that lay under it, all that suffering and all that misfortune that is very
Mm-hmm.
much at the root of that pleasant kind of thing. I think it very well illustrates this story of like a naive, sheltered boy who wants to
Yeah.
feel like he can escape that perfect idyllic life for just a
Mm-hmm.
second, have his adventure, and then go back
Yeah.
like nothing
Go back
happened.
to all.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that's why I feel like at no point do you really get to like these characters. Even like someone like Laura
Mm-hmm.
Dern, by the way, didn't
Yeah.
didn't think she was going to be in this movie. Fantastic performance. That woman keeps
What? One
surprising
of
me.
one of his longtime collaborators is Laura Dern. Yeah.
I did not know that. Every time I
Yeah.
see her in a movie nowadays, I'm like, wow, you were in more than Jurassic Park. Great.
Oh my god. Laura Dern has had an incredibly
She is,
successful and
she
varied
really
career, yeah.
has, and I haven't seen
Mm.
a single fucking thing of it. So every time she pops up, I'm like, huh, nice. I
Yeah,
think
nice.
she
I
does.
like to see Laura Dern.
I think her performance is one of the best things in this movie. I
Hmm.
love the way she plays that like clean cut kind of girl who does everything she's supposed to do, and she's like so intrigued and attracted to the idea of something
Hmm.
that's wrong. I
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
like her like obsessiveness over our protagonist and how
Hmm.
every time he's doing these things that he clearly shouldn't do, she tells him, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." But then she's like all
Yeah.
in helping him do
All
it.
in for the whole
Yeah,
mystery.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
very very interesting because these
Yeah.
two kids really do carry that sense of like that privilege of living in this like idyllic world where they've had loving parents to take care of them.
Hmm.
The biggest tragedy that they've gone through is the dad's heart attack that just happened
Yeah.
suddenly.
At the beginning of
No,
the
there
film, yeah.
wasn't like a log because we're following like a town that's supposed to be this small town of like
Hmm.
logging and woodcutters and stuff.
Hmm.
Very interesting to me. The dad's accident has nothing to do with him working in a mill or like
No.
it's not externally inflicted at all.
Yeah.
The worst thing that happens in their lives is something that comes completely from just life, his body.
Hmm.
It's not, he's not the victim of like abuse at the workplace. He's not
Hmm.
assaulted by a criminal. Nothing to do with anything. It's just, hey,
Hmm.
his arteries, like he has like a heart attack or whatever he does.
Hmm.
It's really interesting. That's like the worst thing that they've ever like experienced, and yet
Hmm.
this idea of like finding a detached ear in the middle of the woods and this fascination with that rot, I think it's
Hmm.
a really interesting way of like reflecting that. And on the opposite
Hmm.
side, you have our woman, the victim of this heinous crime, who's has an attraction to him because what seems like the opposite thing. She's
Hmm.
lives in this darkness. The idea of light and
Yeah.
darkness completely like played throughout the movie. As
Yeah.
soon as we get into what's
His whole filmography is
the
all
whole
about
thing
that,
is like light and dark. Like
duality.
every time
Yeah.
it's daytime,
Hmm.
it's all like
Hmm.
everything's perfect and clean and stuff.
Hmm.
Every time it's nighttime, everything's cringy. All the bad guys are out. Everything is going wrong. It's really interesting. how she clearly likes him because of that. Like it seems like she's
Uh,
attracted to him because of where he comes from, because he's this
mhm.
clean cut kind of like guy who's never really witnessed any of this horror, and how he likes her because of the opposite, because of how embroiled she is in all this mess and all these bad things that are going on underneath,
Yeah.
but also how
Mhm.
detached he is from everything, how he like that moment where she asks him to hit her,
Yeah.
sorry, that idea of like her not knowing love that hasn't been
Yeah.
abusive in some way,
Abusive or
yeah, that
sort of
idea of
morally.
him like not wanting to but then doing it automatically, like
Yeah.
clearly that is within him, he just denies
Uh-huh.
himself that it exists, whereas
Uh-huh.
like she doesn't
Yeah.
know
He
any other form
wants
of love.
to have
Yeah,
that front of being someone good,
yes.
and oh, I would never
Yes,
do something like that.
exactly. And yet
Um.
he sneaks into a woman's apartment who he
Yeah.
doesn't know how she's
Mhm.
connected to anything. As far as he knows,
Mhm.
she's just an innocent woman. He leers at her creepily. He's
Yep.
definitely aroused by everything that happens and
Yes.
horrified at the same time.
Mhm.
It is really interesting. My
Yeah.
biggest pet peeve with the movie is generally just the portrayal of like queerness in it. Obviously, it's an
Mhm.
80s movie, and like with a lot
Yep.
of these, there's Lynch, in wanting to make the audience uncomfortable with what is going on, puts a lot of like queer undertones when it comes to the bad guys and their portrayal.
Mhm.
From the
Yep.
fact of like Dennis's character, I forgot his surname. I was going to say Dennis Quaid again.
Dennis Hopper.
Dennis,
I just can't imagine Blue Velvet with Dennis Quaid. It'd be such a weird
it
experience.
would just be him playing himself, honestly.
It would be,
Uh,
yeah, exactly. He's nuts
it's just him.
himself. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just him being insane at it.
Hey, well, actually, the Substance actually is pretty good over the top Dennis Quaid
Yeah.
performance. So
Uh,
yeah, check that
no, but
out.
it is very interesting, his character. I really like how there's like a depth to him. Clearly there's something to do with like there's a lot of like unwritten things, like
Mhm.
same as like other kind of like filmmakers of the time. I'm thinking of like something like Tarantino in Pulp Fiction. There's a lot of like
Mhm.
stories that aren't really told but are clearly in the mind of the writer.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
could see Dennis Hopper's like whole backstory of an abusive mother, like kind of like abusing him as a child, and him wanting to
Mhm.
take back at her by like
Yeah.
raping women that look like his mother,
Mhm.
making them dress in
Yeah.
this blue velvet. His whole relationship
Mhm.
with music, and how that's
Mhm.
something like I could imagine like a whole like child being abused while music plays,
Yeah.
something like you could see that kind of stuff. So I
Yeah.
think like the writing and the performance and the way the camera kind of like drags you through all of this, it is very unsettling because it feels very real. It feels very
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
None of
Yeah.
his cruelty and abuse seems magical in any way.
Mhm.
We see a
Yeah.
lot of over the top villains that seem larger than life, and this guy
Mhm.
just seems like a guy that could very easily exist. I
Yeah. Yeah.
like the implication that this woman's
Mhm.
like old husband that's been kidnapped also
Yeah.
probably abused her in the same way that this man is
Mhm.
abusing her right now.
Yeah.
Like all of those kind of things, they're very real. They're very gritty. He really shines a light at the part of like the horrors of life that this kind of Americana is trying to hide from.
Yeah.
Even
I th
yeah, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I think
Mm,
I'll like what you say that someone like Frank Booth could exist
mm,
because of these very real traumas and this very detailed backstory that makes you
yeah.
understand,
Mm.
obviously not
Not
condone, but
condone,
makes you
but
understand
understand.
his
Yeah.
his problems and why he's doing what he's doing.
Mm.
And I think you're saying that grittiness and that
Yes.
realistic portrayal of evil.
Yes. Yes.
I think
Very banal again.
because
Like.
there is in his films following Blue
Mm,
Velvet, evil takes on a kind of a different shape.
mm, mm,
Um, but it's kind of most similar to something like Elephant Man,
mm,
where that evil, right? I guess if you want to label it as
mm,
evil or something nasty or
mm,
abusive, because
mm,
there's an abusive character in Elephant Man
mm.
who abuses the John character because of his disfigurement and basically makes him work as a slave in the
Yeah.
circus.
Yeah.
But from that, you understand he also weirdly loves John
Mm,
in that twisted way that you
mm,
understand
mm.
because he's sort of been with him for so long and sort of sees him
as
as
part
like
of
a pet
himself. Yeah,
almost,
yeah.
yeah, and like needs him,
Hmm.
in his life in order to sort of, because he's
Hmm.
an alcoholic as well, needs him to sort of kind of save him and sort
Hmm.
of look
Hmm.
after him through that violence. It's
Hmm.
all very bleak,
Yes.
but there's sort of that psychology you
Yes.
understand, and it's the same with Frank,
Yes. That's
more so
something
than perhaps other villains
that
in
to
the
me is
future
the
of his work.
most horrifying
Uh-huh.
aspect of Frank as a
Hmm.
character. He kind of reveals what was already there.
Hmm.
Like, you
Hmm.
see that same kind of behavior with our protagonist and the way he
Hmm.
treats women as, like,
Yeah.
in that kind of, like, honestly, like that kind of, like, very common, sadly very common, like, masculine way of looking at them, not as, wholly human, but as, like, parts of himself, things that belong to
Yeah.
him. There is a possessiveness. We see that in that very brief scene. I was wondering why it was even there. That
Hmm.
fake out where they're suddenly chased by the car, and it turns out it's the ex-boyfriend rather than the bad
Yes. Yes.
guys.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you feel like, why is this even part of the movie? But then
Yeah.
I looked back and thought back at the confrontation and how
Yeah.
he was talking to, like, the Laura Dern character, the ex-boyfriend, shouting at her to shut up, this is not about you. And
Uh-huh.
it was really interesting because it wasn't about her.
Hmm.
It was never about her. The relationships these men are in have nothing to do with the women they're in a
Hmm.
relationship with. They're everything
Yeah.
to do to showcasing to each other their value as men.
Yeah.
And the reason he's mad is not because he lost a woman that he
Hmm.
cared about. It's because someone else
Hmm.
took her. And he wants
Hmm.
to take back. So
Yeah.
even a scene
Take
like
take
that
back
kind of,
control.
like,
Yeah. Sort of thing.
goes
Yeah.
back to this idea of, like, it's this
Hmm.
masculine, in quotations, kind of world where, like, this whole
Uh-huh.
toxicity and all these, these bugs, these beetles are all
Hmm.
underground, festering,
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
kept hidden in the surface. Like, oh,
Yeah.
he's just a
Yeah.
nice quarterback guy who's just a sports guy, and
Yeah.
he's, oh, you're so keen, so swell. You can imagine some
Yeah.
Pleasantville
Yeah.
bullshit going on of, like, ah, you're
Yeah.
just the keenest.
The
But then,
keenest.
yeah.
And like we're saying, the
Hmm.
way it begins and ends.
Hmm.
Um, like you're saying, I like how you made that
Hmm.
sort of analysis. You point out how it
Hmm.
is just one adventure for
Yeah.
the college boy,
Yeah.
and then we go into the darkness and everything's okay, and
Yeah.
we can go back to this delusion, the niceties, and oh, grandma's smiling.
Exactly.
I always
No
remember
one
her,
no one that
and the end of
dies
Blue Velvet.
no one that
Yeah,
dies
yeah.
or gets hurt are
Hmm.
any of the people from the surface. His dad,
No,
he's there at the
no.
end with the detective.
Yep,
Okay, he
yep.
went through his
Yeah,
surgery. Everything's fine.
it's
He's
fine.
fine.
Yep.
His girlfriend's fine. They're now together.
Uh-huh.
They're living
Uh-huh.
this idyllic thing. Every single
Hmm.
member of their family that was there in that surface
Hmm.
light world, kind of like, oh,
Hmm.
everything is so shiny. 50s, like, a suburb.
Yeah,
Everyone's fine. The
yeah. Of
only
course, not
people
Frank, who's been
the
who's
only
been
people
shot.
exactly the only
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
that suffer any
Hmm.
lasting damage, the only people that get
Hmm.
murdered and
Yeah.
have to do with that darkness. Like, it's
Yeah.
it's the mobsters, it's the
Yeah.
woman's husband. I mean, her psychologically, she's not getting over that shit. Neither is the
Nope.
kid.
Nope.
Even the cop that dared to go under, and work with these people underground, he gets his head blown off in a very
Hmm.
unsettling way as well. Like, he's just
Yeah.
standing with
Yeah.
half his brain out. That was really,
Yeah. Yeah.
really, honestly,
But
I kind of like that
that's
choice.
the
But yeah, yeah,
that's the
it's really
Frank
interesting.
though,
Yeah. Hmm.
because like you're saying,
Hmm.
all the people who already lived their very pleasant life go back to their
Hmm.
pleasant life, but Frank is a victim as well,
Yeah.
and never is his situation. Obviously, we're not talking about a saga; it's a 2 hour plus film,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Hmm.
his problems are never
Never
fully
explored.
addressed or
Nope.
dealt with, or
Nope.
there's no way to reform someone like him.
Hmm.
But he's a victim of his past.
Hmm.
Of his
Yeah,
past
obviously,
experiences as
very
well,
clearly
but
portrayed
it's
as
just we
such.
ignore that.
Yeah.
The problem's gone. It's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
fine.
Yes,
No, it's gonna happen again.
yeah, that's the thing. It's really
Hmm.
interesting. The police raid his thing. They kill all the people, presumably,
Yep.
and there's like, because there's this big shooting. I really like how they don't focus at all on that. That was a really good
Yeah.
choice as well. Like, we just
Yeah.
see gunfire and violence, and we just imply that things happen, because from the perspective of our protagonist, it doesn't fucking matter. These people
No.
don't matter. They're just this fun excursion into the dark side of the world before coming
Yeah.
back into their pleasant lives. He was just like
Yeah.
obsessed with this idea. He found an ear. He was tired of his day to day. He found a detached ear, and he was like, "Oh, I'm really interested in this." Why? Did he ever
Yeah.
want to save this woman from her fate? No. When he found out that this woman's husband and child had been kidnapped and this man was abusing her, his first thing wasn't to go to the police. He doesn't even suggest that until like the third time they sleep together or something. This is about him
Yeah.
and his experience of like sleuthing out, finding these dark secrets and getting muddled in them. He goes completely unscathed. The worst part, the worst thing that happens to him is he gets beat up.
Yeah. I know.
That's it.
And then has to go through a pretty,
Yeah.
grim like car ride and
Yeah.
have to watch a
Oh,
lip
obviously.
syncing
Yeah.
performance from a from a guy doing Roll
Yeah.
Orbison's in
It's
Dreams. Yeah.
it's very interesting, and I feel like, because at the beginning I was like, why am I not empathizing with this character? Why don't I like him?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be a flaw of the movie, but the more I kept watching them, I was like, oh, because Lynch is telling me this is not a good person. We're watching
No.
someone just
Yeah.
pass through other people's
Mm.
lives as like a, like poverty tourism people do these
Yeah.
days, where they go to like
Yeah.
a,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
they go to like a struggling country and take pictures with some children that, they helped build a chalkboard for their school, and then go back to their lives like nothing happened.
Like
it's
nothing happened.
it's
Yeah.
really interesting because he
Yeah.
does paint himself as the hero for the entirety of the
Yeah.
film. I really
Yeah, I
enjoy
really
this. Yeah.
I like your this deep analysis of Blue Velvet because it's also
Mm,
spreads to so much of his work. It sort
mm,
of is that perfect middle film, like I'm saying,
mm,
that spreads on, and these ideas go on further to more extremes, or there's more beauty to be found in some
mm,
of his other work as well.
mm,
But Blue Velvet followed on from the painful production that was Dune.
mm. Yes.
And that was sort of,
Mm,
although Lynch has said he's never actually really fully worked with one of the big studios in
mm,
Hollywood ever in his career.
mm,
This was sort of like he's worked with like one or two financiers or
mm,
producers who are like with a studio,
mm,
and through them has sort of produced his films. And with Blue Velvet,
mm,
I can't really remember what the budget was. I think it may have been $4 or $5 million.
mm,
But he, in order to get final cut for that film, because he had such a disaster with Dune,
mm.
that he never got final cut and all that, and it was such a
Six
big
million.
production, and it
It
was a
seems like.
headache. It was a
Yeah.
6 million, six
6
million.
million.
That was he. In order to get final cut, had to take a quarter of the original
Oh
budget
wow.
in order to be allowed final cut.
Oh wow.
And he was like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, I'm doing that. No way, I don't care."
Yeah.
In order to sort of secure his vision,
Yeah.
and that was something he always
Mm,
kind of went on in sort of advice for filmmakers. Is
mm,
that one of the first things he always say is like, always
mm,
get final cut as a
mm.
creative,
I can understand
which so many
that. Yeah.
filmmakers don't. And if you work for big
Oh
studios, and
yeah.
it's just so interesting that Blue Velvet, one of his most acclaimed and beloved pieces,
Mm,
um, was only made because of a compromise,
mm,
really,
mm,
in order to sort of have a lesser budget than what was
mm.
originally intended for the
Interestingly
script.
enough, I
Um,
believe it was one of his censored films. That after it came out,
hmm.
it kind of got censored in a lot of different countries, and people weren't able
Oh
to
yeah, I
watch
could
them.
imagine that for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Not
It's
anymore, not anymore, obviously.
no, no, yeah, obviously, but it is very
Yeah.
interesting because it does go to show that sometimes when like not understanding something, your reaction is
Mhm.
that of disdain and disgust. And
Yeah.
I've gone
Hmm.
through this. Like the first thing you do
Yeah.
when like something you don't understand, you're like, oh, I don't like it. You
I
know?
don't want to deal with that again.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it is it is an unpleasant film to watch at times. It is
Mhm.
one
Yeah.
that very much rubs in your face some really unpleasant
Absolutely makes you
moments.
uncomfortable for sure.
Yes, I can understand how many
Hmm.
people don't even want to watch this film.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, it is very interesting that he'd sacrifice a budget for the sake of final cuts, and I feel like, especially with when you have like a vision for a film, I think it is very commendable.
Hmm.
And we've talked about this a lot, but it is very commendable to be able to, at least push it to the point where you want it to be. And obviously, filmmaking is a collaborative process. There is no one man working on a film and making the whole thing happen. But it is very different working down with the people that are actually, contributing to the film rather than working up to the executives that are like financing it and distributing it. The people working on a project understand that project to a point and add to the process of the finished product. Every single person that works in a movie makes that movie happen and makes it become the thing that it is. Like a movie, if a director was able to just think it up on his own and then it would just happen.
Those movies, there you go.
Those movies, as directors have them in their heads, would not be half of the thing that we end up seeing, from the actors to the costuming to the sets to the lighting to the cinematography. Every single person that works as part of a production, wanting to or not, no matter how restricted their direction is, they add to the final product. But once you go up from that onto the executives and the financiers, everything that does, in my opinion, is detract from that final product. Their goal isn't to create a vision, isn't to say something, but to sell a product. Therefore, everything that happens from them upwards is trying to take away things from that film. And we've seen it constantly when it comes to big budget films. So I can perfectly understand. I mean, look, a great example is Blade Runner. That was a film that, because of the changes that were made to it, after every creative worked on them, and I created a wonderful story, were negative because they were taking away from the message, taking away from the impact, taking away from the quality of that film. So,
and I think what makes Lynch's career so interesting is that every film he made, he essentially had to really fight for to get made, or the process was long and excruciating. His first film, Eraserhead, took 5 years to make because they kept running out of money as it went along, and he couldn't pay actors, he couldn't pay the crew, so that's why that took. It's an 89-minute film, and it's a very, very low budget, but it took 5 years because of that process, and he eventually got his vision made. And then with the likes of Elephant Man, the only reason that came to existence is because Mel Brooks was a fan of Eraserhead and was willing to produce that film.
Again,
and then
a creative person who saw something interested and said, "Hey, I happen to have money. Let me actually finance it for you."
I'll finance this.
No studio
that
would
really
finance
made
something
him
like that.
Yeah, and that really made him blow up because that's such a well put together piece of work. And then, like I've seen, Dune was an arduous process, and so much got cut and left on the floor, and it was a disaster. Blue Velvet, you had to make that compromise. And then even when we get to the likes of Twin Peaks, and the Twin Peaks is really fascinating, right? Because that was kind of the next thing after Blue Velvet, and that's the thing that changed television forever. This is one of the most important pieces of television ever put on the small screen.
Before Twin Peaks, the idea of like serialized storytelling was just like a vague whisper in the heads of.
I mean, you did have, obviously had
TV
shows
stuff, you had serialized
drama
stuff.
TV shows before.
You had a lot of telenovelas,
but not to this.
Which you had a lot of this idea of like the big drama thing where like every episode you reveal someone dead who's actually not dead, or someone who's fake, or someone who's pregnant. But like it's the kind of serialized TV where like overall they weren't telling a cohesive story. They were just adding on top of what happened at the end of the last episode.
Whereas Lynch and Mark Foster, I mean, that was kind of the brilliant sort of twist of the Twin Peaks thing, is that, okay, we'll start off, and yes, there is that soap opera feel and quality to it. It's melodramatic. It's an idyllic America, like we've seen in Blue Velvet. It's this town with all these beautiful forests nearby, and there's a diner, and
Very
everyone's
American,
sexy and all that stuff, right? And then there is that real cinematic quality. There's that real, let me say, that Lynchian surrealism that comes into it, that real darkness that really happens in that brilliant pilot episode. I think one of the best bits of the entire pilot is when you find out without any dialogue that Laura has died. They do that whole sequence where you're in this classroom in school, and someone's missing from school. There's the empty chair, and then there's a scream, and then everyone looks out and there's a girl running, screaming in the playground, and then a cop enters, and then they say something to the teacher. The teacher is then in shock. They look at the chair again, and then the friends of Laura look up at each other,
It's so
and then she
brilliant.
just begins to cry. And
It's so brilliant.
it's
It's
just
so
phenomenal
brilliant. Yeah.
storytelling, and
I
it's
love
so
visual storytelling
it's a
so
pilot. It's a
much. Yeah.
really emotional
It is. It
pilot as
is.
well.
Yeah.
It's really
It's very heavy.
really
Again,
impactful
we
and
were talking
heavy.
about this before we started. It felt like a movie to me. Like that
Yeah.
pilot episode felt very much like a film. Like it has a
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
filmy quality to it, and that is
Yeah.
not common at all at the time.
No, no.
Like
Um,
even
and,
when you got more
uh,
complex kind of like stories, like one of my favorite shows from even before Twin Peaks is the Prisoner, that British 60s show. Even
okay.
something like that needs to have that beginning part where like it
Hmm.
explains what the point of the story is every single
Right.
episode, so
Yeah.
you
Yeah. Yeah.
understand what
Yeah.
the fuck
Yeah.
is going on. And that was a
Uh,
surreal piece of whatever the hell was going on. Even
yeah.
like a very weirdly like, you know, kind of like show that didn't really have that impact, and again one of those that was only made because of a concession. Someone
Yeah.
who had gotten a lot of money by doing a very straightforward television
Hmm.
series, who was given the time, power, and the money to be able to run whatever the fuck they wanted, you know. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it
And
is very
that's
interesting. Yeah.
and like TV was so insular before as well. It was like, oh, get everything done. Yeah, you have a
Yes.
series, but
Yes.
everything's done within the episode.
Yeah.
Like, so you can watch
You
any
need to
episode, Twilight
syndicalize
Zone
it.
or
Yeah,
Doctor Who,
exactly. Yeah.
anything like that.
Everything
But then
finishes in
obviously
one
Twin
episode.
Peaks
Yeah.
was we're going to carry on this
Yeah.
thing, and like I'm saying, like before with everything David Lynch fought with. He once again had to fight with ABC, even though Twin Peaks was the biggest show at the time. And although he had to leave for the majority of season 2 because he was working, he was making Wild at Heart, which he won the Cannes Palme d'Or for.
Oh fuck.
If you look at his body of work, that is not the film you'd think he'd win the Palme d'Or at Cannes for. But whatever. Anyway, and then ABC Studios really wanted the killer to be known, even though David Lynch and Mark Foster never wanted the killer to ever be revealed, really, and it was sort of it's perfectly said by Bobby in the show at the funeral of Laura in like the second episode. He's like, we all killed her. And that was kind of the point that, much like we were saying with Blue Velvet, you have all these, stand-up individuals who all have their
It takes a
own,
village.
career. Everyone's smiling and everyone's
Yeah.
saying, how do you do and good morning, and everyone's
Yeah.
really polite and nice. But because of their complacency and lack of willing to do anything to actually help someone in trouble, led to her death. But then, of course, there's the whole other weird shit going on in Twin Peaks. There's the weird, surreal worlds. There's the other dimensions. I mean, and of course, there is evil incarnate in not Bobby, Bob himself, who's a terrifying figure who appears in the show.
Few things have been
And we kind of
as like referenced as that red hall from Twin Peaks. Like,
the Red Room.
Yeah, few things have been as like impactful to like just filmmaking and storytelling as a whole. Like, I remember rewatching fucking a Scooby-Doo series and suddenly seeing them do a whole episode in the Red Hall, and I was like, what the heck? Like, yeah, generally I was like, the amount of like people that have been impacted by the way Twin Peaks like told this story and tackled its themes and created this uneasy world where weirdly enough the day-to-day interactions of the normal human beings felt more uneasy than any of the weird shit going on. It was fascinating.
I agree.
It's really powerful kind of story. Yeah,
and that's like that's sort of also where that sort of perfect Lynchian particularness comes into play. If you watch Twin Peaks, is that his ability to sort of swing or oscillate between the pleasant everyday and then go into that dark and weird and surreal stuff. But so it seemed, when you watch it, it seems so simple and so effortless.
Yeah.
But the tonal shift to do that is like, it's mind blowing. And that's why he has his own style named after himself because of his ability to create that feeling.
Yeah.
So just like I'm saying, it's just so natural in his when you
Mm.
watch his work.
Mm.
And if you watch any other film, like we complain or we critique films, or we go,
Mm.
"Oh, the tonal shift was off
Mm.
there."
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, that
Constantly. Yeah.
tonal shift
Yeah.
isn't
Constantly.
a problem in any of his works because that's
No.
kind of
And
his
I
perfect
think it all
thing.
comes from the fact that he understands character. It all
Yeah.
comes from the fact that everything he does is a study of human beings. And he doesn't
Hmm.
treat them
Absolutely.
as like 2D tropes. He treats them
Hmm.
as like deep human beings, because all of that weirdness, what it seems to me
Hmm.
to be, is literally just bringing everything that's inside a person out to the surface. It's not
Hmm.
just, oh, here's a random flash of something that happens, ooh, loopy, woo, kind
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
wavy stuff. It's not just like, the end of a Space Odyssey, where it's just a bunch
Yeah.
of stuff that, like, you could interpret however you want or whatever.
Hmm.
Like, it seems like with these moments, what he's doing is showing us what lies under the surface of his characters.
Yeah.
He's taking the
Yeah.
skin off, the veneer off, that like pretend of, and he's showing this is
Hmm.
who they really are. This is what's really
Yeah.
under here. And that's
And
why I
I
feel
think,
like it feels so seamless, because it's the
yeah,
same story. He's just telling it in
and
a
I,
different way. Yeah.
there's a really great interaction
Mm.
between the famous film critic Roger Ebert and
Mm.
David Lynch,
Mm.
because Roger Ebert for years
Mm.
did not like David Lynch's
Mm.
films.
Mm.
I think he found them really violent and disgusting. I don't think he
Yeah.
was even a fan of Blue Velvet. He wasn't a
Mm.
fan of Wild at Heart,
Yeah,
and the
good luck
story
with
went on.
that.
And and then
Yeah.
Mulholland Drive happened,
Mm.
which I mean that's his most acclaimed
Mm. I
work.
need to watch Mulholland
Um,
Drive.
and it's
Yes.
like there's the BBC Culture poll
Mm.
famously put it as the greatest film of the 21st century. I
Mm.
think it's still number one.
Mm.
Came out in 2001, so
Mm.
24 years later, still no better film has come out. And
Mm.
in that interaction, right, because they've obviously known of each other's reputation before, and he's literally at the Oscars.
Mm.
David Lynch is nominated for Best Director for Mulholland Drive,
Mm.
and he says, he's got the microphone. He's like, "Oh, here you are, David. I've been looking for you. I've been wanting to talk to you." And he basically says, "Look, I'm going to go back to the film university like tomorrow,
Mm.
and me and my students are going to watch this thing over and over. We're going to pause every frame. We're going to spend 10 hours analyzing this film to see what the hell is going on, because it is such a
Mm.
I'll get into it. It's such a crazy experience,
Yeah.
Mulholland Drive. And David Lynch says, and then he said, Roger Ebert says to David Lynch, I may not understand
Mm.
Mulholland Drive or all of it, but I really emotionally connected with it.
Mm.
And that's why, and Roger Ebert truly loved that film. Then Lynch was
Mm.
like, well, yeah, that's all that matters.
Mm.
Like, it's like, that's the only thing that matters.
Yeah, the
When you watch my
analysis
film is
part
that you
is
emotionally
for
connect with it.
yeah, the
Yeah,
analysis part for
and
weirdos like us who actually
yeah,
enjoy doing that kind of
yeah,
shit. Yeah.
yeah. And like you're saying, it's like it's because his characters feel so genuine,
Mm.
and when all this weird otherworldly stuff is happening, you
Mm.
really do care. And there's a real, and his ideas are very clear, and his
Mm.
thesis are very clear. And like I'm saying, once again, in Mulholland Drive, David Lynch had to fight for this thing
Mm.
because originally it's really remarkable when you watch it because it was, I think 2/3 of it, 3/4 of it, of the footage of that film
Mm.
was made for a TV pilot. Like
Oh
Mulholland
wow.
Drive is meant to be a TV series,
Oh
right?
wow. Yeah.
Once again,
Mm.
problems happened, funding got pulled. So David Lynch was just
Yeah.
left with this
Yeah.
3/4 of a pilot of
Wow.
his TV series, and he's like, oh, completely disheartened. And
Yeah.
then a French company comes in
Oh.
and man, I think gives him like $1 or $2 million to
Mm.
finish it off and
Mm.
try and edit this mess he's made into a feature film.
Wow.
And the genius of it. I don't want to spoil it, right? But obviously, it deals with like different realities and dreams. And he's even said that Naomi Watts is playing potentially 6 different people in this film,
Wow.
because you're jumping between this sort of dream world. I always think, because when I talked
Mm.
about this, we did a whole episode of films we changed our mind on, and I watched Mulholland Drive,
Mm.
and the first time I watched it, like 6 years ago now,
Mm.
I didn't like it.
Mm.
I thought I got it. I
Mm.
thought it was pretentious.
Mm.
I was like, oh, it's whatever.
Mm.
And then I watched it again, and the second time I watched it, I actually cried at the ending of
Mm.
it because I
Mm.
thought it was so beautiful. I was like, oh my god, I was so
That's
arrogant.
so interesting because
Um,
I had a
uh,
similar like thing just during the watching of Blue Velvet.
The experience of watching
Yeah,
Blue
yeah, yeah.
Velvet.
I loved the beginning. Then I was like in the middle, like, oh, this is kind of
Hmm.
pretentious. I kind of feel like this is like
Uh-huh.
hokey. And then I got
Uh-huh.
really into it up until the end.
Yeah.
Like I had like a
Yeah.
little bit of a tippy top where I
Yeah.
was like, I feel
Uh-huh.
like it also does speak to the fact that as viewers, and this is
Hmm.
something that I know I've personally struggled with, like actually
Uh-huh.
being genuine is seen
Uh-huh.
as like this sign of like weakness, this thing of ridicule. So whenever I come
Uh-huh.
across a very sincere film, it does usually
Hmm.
feel either embarrassing or hokey or like, oh, you're
Hmm.
trying too
Yeah.
hard.
But there is a
Yeah.
hokiness, especially in some of his work. Like
Mm.
it's purposely that way. Like
Yes.
when you
Yes.
watch Twin Peaks for the first
Mm.
time, some of the acting, you're like,
Mm.
that feels like really stilted,
Yeah.
and like it just feels, it doesn't feel realistic or
Feels
off
off. Yeah.
because he doesn't care. He doesn't want
Exactly.
realism in
It's
his work. He wants
supposed
his
to
work to
feel
be like
off.
dreams and
Exactly.
weird.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like some
and
of
I
the
like that. And everything
conversations they
is.
have and some of the dialogue, it feels
Yeah.
like what the heck are they even like?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
yeah.
why it's off, and but it's so distinct.
Mm,
And there's this great quote Dale
mm,
Cooper says in Twin Peaks, and he says, "I have no idea where this is going to lead us,
mm,
but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both weird, wonderful, and strange."
mm,
And that
mm.
should
Yeah,
be on every David Lynch
yeah.
poster
Mm,
because that's the experience of watching a David Lynch
mm,
film almost. And like I was saying with something like Mulholland Drive, is
mm,
that you watch it. If you watch it for the first time, it is a difficult watch for the first time.
mm,
Absolutely, it's one of these things. Like I say, I didn't particularly vibe with it
mm,
until a second watch where I
mm,
really really loved it, and it became my favorite Lynch film.
mm,
Um, because there's so many different fragmented pieces. But when you really look at it, it becomes a meta
mm.
commentary on David Lynch's struggles with the Hollywood system,
Oh,
as well as being like this eulogy
mm,
for all the people who like Hollywood discarded
mm,
or have forgotten about, and as well as this sort of
mm,
even a good like even just sort of analysis of how dreams even function, like
mm,
how we piece fragments of our lives to create our own dream realities.
mm,
um and so even dealing with like trauma and guilt as well,
mm,
it's just such a magnum opus of everything he
mm.
did. And then, like I'm saying, he pieced it together from the
That's
shattered
insane.
TV pilot he was trying
That
to
is
make.
insane to me. I really need
Which
to
is
watch Mulholland
insane.
Drive now. That sounds absolutely
Uh-huh.
insane. I'll have to force myself to watch it at least twice.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
if
you
I
might fall in love
absolutely
with it the
hate
first
it
time you
the
watch
first
it.
time, I can give myself an opportunity to love it again.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. But
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
there's that thing because there's darkness
hmm,
in so much of his work, and I
hmm,
think that kind of gets a lot of attention. But
yeah,
there's also a lot of beauty in it as
hmm,
well. I think Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me is, I
hmm.
think, arguably his dark. I mean, that and Twin Peaks: The Return,
Oh,
that
yeah,
gets pretty bleak towards the end.
hmm,
But Fire Walk with Me, the actual just singular experience of that, is a really hard
hmm,
watch. It's really dark, it's terrifying. But then the ending
hmm,
is something sort of transcendental, something ethereal, and something that makes all the horrors you've seen kind of be like,
hmm,
maybe it's okay. And I think he has a lot of that, even in a lot of his bleak work. He
hmm.
has that reassurance
I will say, even
sometimes.
Blue Velvet,
Uh-huh,
which is one that kind of
uh-huh,
like, besmirches the image of the people we're following throughout the movie. Like, we're not
yeah,
supposed to like these people, or at least I feel like we're not supposed to like these people, and their happy ending is not very
yeah,
happy. Like, it's good for them, but we're supposed to be upset by that idea of just, oh, they just left all this shit behind, kept going with their ideal lives. It is a really interesting choice, and one that did need to happen, that the
yeah.
movie ends with a slow motion of the kid whose face we never see just running up
Hmm.
to his mother, them finally
Hmm.
reunited. And it's really
Hmm.
interesting to me that he chose that as the climax of the film, because we've just seen the
Hmm.
phony happy ending. We've just seen the symbology
Yeah,
of like that songbird that's supposed to be like, oh, the love that's like,
yeah. The sparrows, yeah, or something.
what's the bird
Mm.
holding into its mouth? The grandma very actively says, "Oh, I couldn't eat a bug," and then the camera zooms into the fact that the bird has a beetle in his mouth. The same
Mhm.
beetles that we
Yeah,
saw represent like
um,
this kind of underworld, this kind of dark side at the beginning of the
yeah,
movie. It's really interesting to me that we cut from that to the mum and the child getting reunited again, because it's, to me, at least, it meant like a lot. Like, that kind of summed up the kind of story that the film is trying to tell. And to me, it ended in kind of a high note, because this horrible world that society ignores, that they just let fester, that hurts so many people and causes so much pain, because literally everyone we've seen from this bottom of the rung kind of world ends up suffering for their actions. Everyone is in some way abused or like hurt. There's no one on top. There's no one who's like everything's going great in their life and they're just, taking advantage of everyone else. It's really interesting that it ends with that moment of happiness with these two people that are supposed to represent that underground, that dark world. It seems to me like a message of, despite everything, despite the appearance of darkness and horror and everything horrible that happens in it, we see this light, this moment of, but the real love, the true love, isn't this, well, we're the blonde girl and the guy, the old guy, they get together and have their 50s house. The real love that it's showing us, the actual songbird, is the dirty one, is the one that's with the bugs, is the one that is the love between the mother and the child. That's the real love. We haven't seen any real love in this movie except for that. And that's really interesting to me. That's really interesting.
And I think he has all those elements in many of his works. Like there is that Elephant Man is a very very tender and beautiful film. And I think if you want to avoid any of the dark and nasty stuff that David Lynch has put out in some of his work, watch The Straight Story. Lynch's co-produced Disney film.
Oh wow!
I'm not making up. A U certificate David Lynch film.
Oh wow!
Which is literally about a man's journey across America on his lawnmower. I won't tell you why he's doing this journey.
I feel like such
a beautiful, tender film, and the main character in it is just so charming and so endearing that it's just such a lovely watch. Of course, by the end of it, it will absolutely move you. I think it's a really tender, beautiful film that he made there.
Well, I love films.
But when you sort of, when you look at David Lynch's filmography, because he only made 10 films, and then obviously co-created the Twin Peaks series and directed a bunch of episodes, and directed all 18 episodes of Twin Peaks: The Return, by the way, which are 18 hours of Lynch weirdness and darkness and all sorts of and kind of beautiful elements going on there. But when you look at his filmography, at least, every single one of his films is so distinct and unique that is very, like, even when we talk about legendary filmmakers, like we talk about even Scorsese or Hitchcock, even I don't know, like John Ford or Spielberg.
They still have like a very similar...
maybe not Spielberg. I'd maybe put in a different category, but when you look at those other ones I mentioned, like there is a sort of uniformity to a lot of what they make, which isn't a bad thing. They've also made absolute masterpieces. That's what I'm saying. They're sort of they're masterful, but they have a sort of niche. Even Scorsese, who is also varied, has some sort of niches and things that he returns to.
You can tell a Scorsese film just by like the themes, the kind of like topics that he dwells into. Like it's all about that grungy New York. It's all about the mafia life. It's all about that kind of
like there's a lot of films that have that, absolutely. But Lynch never returned to anything. Like every one of his films is so individual and set in different parts of life and sometimes different dimensions, and some are ghost stories, or like I was saying, an old man crossing the country, or even just like or like a weird dreamscapes and dealing with all sorts of crazy and
so it's more the tone
different things.
That seems consistent rather than the subject.
And I think that's what will always make him stand out, is that his body of work is so distinct. Sort of like the closest thing you can think of is someone like Kubrick, maybe. Because Kubrick, so many of his films are so different and distinct from one another that he's up there with him because of his films are so unique.
Kubrick isn't one that really repeated when it came to subject matter.
He never repeated much.
He explored it fully in a film, and then he just abandoned it.
Exactly, I mean, he did Clockwork Orange, and then The Shining, and Eyes Wide Shut, and 2001, all Barry Lyndon, all different genres and experiences, which I think Lynch falls into that category, as Kubrick is one of a true American auteur. And I want to leave you with this quote before we sign off as well, is that one thing he said, and I think it's a thing you should really take with you when you're going into any film or watching any film, even though modern cinema has an obsession with making sure everything makes sense and making sure everything is realistic and realism is sort of the thing. But he said, I don't know why people think a film should make sense when they don't accept the fact that life doesn't make sense. And I love that
That's a
quote,
really good quote.
from David Lynch. Because life doesn't make sense. And we shouldn't obsess with films making sense.
Yeah.
And if you want films to make sense, maybe don't watch some of David Lynch's stuff. But
we could do a whole episode about that culture of nitpicking filmmaking mistakes, and like the idea of like trying to be like, but what was this character doing in this moment, or why is this happening, or like what really happened, or those fucking videos on YouTube of like ending explained.
Ending
explained. Ending explained.
The
Beetle is actually
that comes up is Ending Explained.
Oh god,
I tell you.
Did you not realize that the Beatles were actually him trying to introduce the character from DC, the Beetle, for his next sequel movie after Blue Velvet? That's why Blue Beetle. See, get it? It's actually
we have to bring somehow. We did an hour and 5 minutes of this, and we got a goddamn comic book thing in there.
Anyway, we have to. Otherwise, no one's going to listen to this. Blue Beetle explained. Yes.
But yes, it's very sad that he has passed away.
Yeah, I am glad that I get to explore his filmography now, and I'm glad that I have someone that I can talk to about it who really has a lot of love and passion about it. So yeah.
I actually got not the Christmas, just the last Christmas, a really good David Lynch book. I've read David Lynch, a retrospective. It's a really, really well put together book about all his films and the productions behind them and the problems with them, and also just an analysis of what happens in those films. It's a really brilliant book. But look, let's sign off there. So thank you very much, Gonzalo, for joining me.
Happy to have joined you. Thank you for making me have a deep dive into this wonderful director, and I'm hooked now, and I will be watching more of Lynch's movies, and I will be hating them. And
I wonder which, like I'm saying,
I
really want to know which one you choose to watch next. So you're gonna go left, or you're gonna go right?
Yes, that is the question. Amazing.
But yes, look, we just gave our opinions on David Lynch, the master filmmaker, and a complete unknown, but at the end of the day, those were our unwanted opinions. Thank you very much.